This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
Second thing is that you need to define your boundaries. You need to define your boundaries. Now, normally we think of one boundary, particularly in couple relationships. We're not going to cross this boundary. This is what we've set up as a boundary. But there are really a number of boundaries in any relationship. The first one being boundaries of permission. The boundaries of permission. What will the two of you allow to happen in that relationship? Here we're talking about any kind of relationship. What will the two of you allow to happen in that relationship? We tend to think of couple relationships here, but really this principle applies to all relationships in a number of different ways. For example, and these are all within the boundaries of permission, how transparent am I going to be with this person or these people? And how transparent do I want that person to be? Am I going to allow myself to cross the line from a business relationship to a friendship relationship? Or perhaps from a friendship relationship to a business relationship? It's possible that you can maintain a good business relationship without crossing that boundary of permission into friendship relationships. It's certainly possible. The other dangerous thing, though, is to have a friendship relationship and then decide that you're going to get into a business relationship. That can destroy a friendship relationship. What are those boundaries of permission that you've decided that we're not going to give ourselves permission to cross this boundary? Another question is, am I willing to let this person inconvenience me? Another question is, am I willing to let this person get to the point where I have to trust them? The other side of that question is, am I willing to let them trust me? Am I willing to trust these people? What do they have to do to get to the point where I can trust them? And am I willing to let them trust me? Here's another one. What am I willing to give and what do I expect in return in this relationship? What am I willing to give and what do I expect in return? Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out, particularly in the case of couples relationships, but this principle is true, this statement is true for all relationships. The person who violates another person's boundaries of permission has violated your standards and therefore is not worthy of the relationship. That's so critical to understand. Particularly in dating relationships, and I want to say this because I know that there are a number of young people and some singles in our group. In dating relationships, the minute that person that you are dating violates your boundary of permission, that person has violated your standard. And if that person violates your standard, that person is not worthy of the relationship. Now, that doesn't mean that person can't change. But immediately when that person violates that boundary, you need to blow the whistle and the game stops. Because they have crossed a boundary of permission. So there's the boundaries of permission. Then there is the boundaries of persuasion. Boundaries of persuasion. How far the two of you will go and what you will do to influence each other. When I build a business relationship with somebody, for example, in my business, it's important for me to make a determination. How far do I expect this relationship to go? And so then I operate very differently than somebody who's just giving me a one-time job that I need to do and they need to have it done quickly and they don't ever expect to be part of my life again. Now, I treat them as professionally as possible, you understand. That there are some people that I build connections with because I know that in the long term, I'm going to be good for them and they're going to be good for me. Same thing is true in friendships, in relationships of family, and certainly in couple relationships. How far do you expect this relationship to go and what will you do to influence each other? In other words, what will you do to influence that person and what will it take for that person to influence you? What is that person going to have to do in your life to influence you? Boundaries of persuasion. The third boundary is the boundary of potential. The boundary of potential. At what point or when does the relationship cease to be a benefit and become a liability? That's the boundary of potential. What is the potential in this relationship where it can become an absolute benefit or it can become a liability? Where is that line that crosses where it becomes a liability? There's an interesting turn of events that happens in the scriptures concerning a guy named Demas. He's only mentioned 3 times in the Bible. All 3 times he's mentioned by the Apostle Paul. And let me share these scriptures with you. The first time is in Colossians chapter 4, verse 14. And Paul mentions, and he says in Colossians, he says, our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings. He's writing to the church at Colossae, and he's saying to them, Luke is with me, and Demas. And so they all knew Demas. Everybody knew who Demas was, and so for him to just say, Demas says hello, everybody goes, oh, Demas, you know. And then the second time he's mentioned is in Philemon, which is only one chapter long, verses 23 and 24. He says this, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus. Now notice this, my fellow prisoner. He's in prison when he writes this. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends you greeting, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. So Demas was very much involved in Paul's life. He was part of the ministry. Things were happening, and Demas was there. And then a very lonely statement later on that Paul makes to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, verses 9 and 10. Do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Now, sadly, this happens all too often. People build relationships, they give their love and their loyalty to each other, they set goals, they dream big, they may even accomplish some great things together, but something goes wrong along the way for a number of reasons. It could be sin, it could be loss, it could be distraction, it could be discouragement, it could be a change of priorities, and the relationship begins to fade. Sometimes it fades slowly, sometimes it fades quickly, but something ends the relationship altogether at some point. And I want you to notice something. By the way, it doesn't happen in everyone. I'm talking about those times when it does go, when it does fade, and when it does fall apart. And I want you to notice something. In this case that we've given about Demas and Paul, we're talking about Christians. These were Christians, and the relationship fell apart. Christians can find themselves going in different directions also. Sometimes that's healthy. Sometimes that's positive. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes it's just part of growing spiritually. There have been lots of people that God has put in my life for a period of time that God used to develop me, and at some point it was time for them to move in a new direction. It was time for me to move in a different direction. I mean, I served for 8 years at a church in Florida, and it was a great ministry. It was just one of those ministries that was foundational to who I am and what I accomplished and what I'm up to today. Marcia and I will both tell you that that ministry changed our lives. But there came a point where it was time where God said, okay, now that I've put you in this learning time, this learning period for 8 years, it's time to move on so that I can use what I've taught you in other places. It's time to move on. Sometimes that happens and it's a good thing. But sometimes the other person loses the same focus and passion that made the relationship work, and that boundary of potential gets crossed. In other words, the relationship ceases to be a benefit or a blessing, and then it becomes a liability. So in your relationships, you need to set that boundary of potential. In other words, at what point, or what has to happen for the relationship to cease to be a benefit and become a liability. And then the fourth boundary is the boundaries of power. What are the strengths that that person has to offer in the relationship that you are willing to respond to appropriately? What are that person's strengths? What are your strengths, and are they willing to respond appropriately to your strengths? And likewise, what are their weaknesses and what are your weaknesses? And are you willing to acknowledge their weaknesses and tolerate them? And are they willing to acknowledge your weaknesses and tolerate them? You know, now, a lot of times you don't know those strengths and weaknesses until you get into the relationship. But the relationship initially is built on a set of strengths. That's one of the things that draws those two people, or those people in plural, numerous people, into a relationship. And that relationship begins to grow, and you begin to discover more and more about each other's strengths and each other's weaknesses. But it's okay to have those weaknesses. Marcia and I have been married, and she finds more and more weaknesses every day in me. You know, and I don't know how she tolerates it, but she does, and I'm grateful for that. But the fact of the matter is that a relationship has to depend on strengths and accept weaknesses. So those are those four boundaries, the boundaries of permission, persuasion, potential, and power. Those four boundaries will help you to understand what those boundaries are to define a right relationship.